Okay, we're at 1:07 on my clock. So I am going to just quickly introduce Amy. So the people who were at the Book People conference in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago would have seen Amy during the romance session there, which was what prompted me to flurry and reach out to Amy and ask her to do this because I think it was so instructive and so informative. So I hope that you all enjoy it and find a lot of value in it. Amy is when I wrote this morning, I had the number 5 in my list, but actually Amy is the author of 10 novels. She's got a couple of pen names uh, and she's got lots of titles on the future as well. So it's very, very exciting. But not only is Amy an author, she is also a very serious academic, associate professor of creative writing at the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at Flinders University in Adelaide. But she also has obviously a very strong focus and a lot of knowledge on the romance genre, which is very diverse, no matter what the journalist from the Post says. So without further ado from me, I'm going to pass the metaphorical mic to Amy to tell you all about the romance genre.
Thanks, Renee. Thank you for having me. If you were in Melbourne, there might be some similar content, but it's always helpful to hear it again, I think. So as Renee said, I am a scholar into genre fictions, so mostly historical fiction, popular romance studies, a little bit of horror and climate fiction, but popular romance studies is kind of my bread and butter. And then I also write, I've had 3 names I've published under. I'm only publishing under these 2 at the moment. And I think I saw Bailey there, so I know that I have some people who love the Amy Barry books in New Zealand. Before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge that this presentation was written and given on Kaurna country, and it's never been ceded. And I want to acknowledge the rich storytelling tradition of the Kaurna people on whose land that I live and work, and to extend that respect to any First Nations people here today or the lands on which you're living and working. So romance is a lot more complicated than people think. People have a kind of common sense understanding of the genre that just isn't that reflective of what it actually is, especially because popular fictions change really quickly because they're cultural studies, they're cultural kind of products. They move really fast. So, a romance from 2024 is very different from one in 2014, is very different from one in 2004, is very different to Julie Cooper and the 60s Mills and Boons, because they reflect what people are thinking and feeling about love, romance, sex, all of those things. They're really culturally specific. So obviously also they're culturally specific in terms of if you were to have a romance novel set in Wellington, it would be quite different to one set in the US or the UK, and yet we tend to flatten it all down. And we, as people living in Australia and New Zealand, know we get a lot of cultural content from elsewhere. So we're often taking in these narratives about love and sex from other cultures as well. So romance writers of America and romance writers of Australia put forward these definitions of romance that tend to be foundational, but they're a little bit in flux. So they define romance as having 2 basic elements: a love story that's central to the story, to the novel, and an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending. So once upon a time, that might have meant, like in a Jane Austen, getting married at the end. That's not so true anymore. It's really just about 2, possibly even more people now that we have polyamorous books and reverse harem books and all of those kinds of stories. It's about people and their intimate sexual lives in a happy story or a happy context. So the idea is that it's supposed to be emotionally satisfying and optimistic. However, Gen Z has kind of complicated that a lot, like Gen Z and millennials. So if you, I don't know how many of you are on the social medias, but if you get out there, what they're categorizing as a romance doesn't fit these definitions often. They've redefined a romance. So if you're selling Colleen Hoover, you would know she's often called a romance by readers, but actually doesn't always have an optimistic or emotionally satisfying ending. And there are probably other books you can think of that you might put on a romance shelf that don't fit that definition anymore. So it is a definition that's constantly changing. So I wouldn't get too hung up on definitions too much. It's really about an emotional story about two people and love and sex, or more than two people and love and sex. I kind of think once you've been around the books long enough, and if you're following what the readers like, if you have a look on social media at what readers are following, you kind of learn to recognize it by instinct, even if it doesn't quite fit the genre. Now, the genre is really hard to understand in terms of data, as you guys would probably know, because Amazon, for example, don't really share their data or their granular data. So a lot of sales are kind of slightly invisible to us. And I have had conversations with Amazon editors and publishers, and they know a lot more than they say. They know a lot of granular data that they're not sharing because it's their IP. And we can talk about the mess of them being booksellers and publishers and all the rest of it later if you want. So this data is really not very nuanced. It's not, no one ever kind of teases apart, are you talking about all paperbacks? Are you talking about mass market paperbacks? Are trades included in this? But the kind of blunt data says that some years romance makes up to almost 50% of all paperbacks sold. In 2022, Nielsen Bookscan said it made up globally 33% of all paperbacks sold. And it kind of is a $1 to $1.7 billion industry globally. So this data is from the Alliance of Independent Authors in 2022. I think this is interesting because it's showing what indie authors are getting out of Amazon. This is their Amazon data. And you can see here that romance is double the next genre down, which is crime, which is such a shock, I think, every time I look at it. And horror, which is on the rise. I don't know if you guys have been noticing that in your bookstores. Horror is probably, I would say, the next fastest rising genre at the moment. It's just sort of hitting the New York Times bestseller list this month. Riley Sager's hitting the New York Times again. But you can see horror's only in 2022, 79 million, whereas romance is 1.44 billion. So romance is, however you look at the data, the biggest market share of any genre. Obviously, COVID helped the genre. I think it was a very difficult time and everyone was shut in and a lot of people were reading and they were looking for texts that kind of had a more optimistic affect or were a little bit escapist. So in The Guardian, they reported on the Nielsen Bookscan data from 2021, and they said that there were more than 212 million print books sold in 2021 in the UK. That increased sales, so fiction was up 20%. It was driven by genre fiction, by commercial genres like crime, science fiction, fantasy, and romance. So crime and thrillers were up 19% in the UK, science fiction and fantasy were up 23%, but romance went up 49% in 2021. And it was already like the biggest selling commercial genre, so it went up again. This is from Book Riot, and this is during the 2020 pandemic. The dark green slice is romance. So romance went up 17.5% in 2020. But you can also see the pink wedge is about more variety. So I think a lot of people were trying things they wouldn't normally try. So I think a lot of genres went up, but romance just leapt again. I think one thing we have to keep in mind is, I don't know if you noticed this in your stores, there is a gender reading gap globally that women and girls tend to read more than boys and men. And given that this is a kind of historically feminized genre, it kind of makes sense to me that these numbers are big, given that women and girls tend to read it. And apologies, I'm being very cis focused here. I'm happy to talk about that more at the end. But the genre has tended to be a fairly, has reflected the privilege of kind of cisness, able-bodiedness, whiteness, straightness, and we still see that even though it's diversifying. So NPR in the US reported last June that romance books were on the rise even though the fiction market was softening last year. And sales of romance print books increased 52% in the 12 months ending May 2023. And much of that growth can be attributed to the younger generations and BookTok, the rise of BookTok, and also the rise of filmed productions like Bridgerton I don't know if anyone watched the new Anne Hathaway, I've forgotten the name, that's based on the Harry Styles fan fiction. Or, I mean, if you turn on Netflix or any of your streaming services, you can see a lot of these romance books are being picked up and translated to screen. So that discovery is happening both ways, with people discovering things on Netflix and then finding the books. So romance was the top growth subject in the US book market for the second year in a row last year, which, given its size already, is pretty astonishing. And then this is from February this year. Book sales in the US slumped in 2023 overall, but it was a sweeter story for romance novels. Reliably a $1 billion a year industry, the genre mushroomed over the past several years. Now emerging authors in the format regularly outsell other kinds of fiction. Just last week, the top spots on the New York Times bestseller fiction list, this was in February, were held by romance novels including Sarah Maas. And I'm not sure if everyone heard, but this week Sarah J. Maas just surpassed 5 million sales for her books. So she's really kind of found a very devoted readership. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the genre mashing going on there in a minute. So romance was once an embarrassing mainstay of the publishing world, but is getting a little bit more respect thanks to the newer generations of romance writers and fans who don't have the same level of shame around the genre that some of us might have experienced when we were younger. So this was in the promotional material for tonight's webinar, and this is from the recent Nielsen BookScan data around romance. And I think it's interesting that they're calling it romance and sagas, because I think that reflects the rise of romantasy, which all of you would have seen with the rise of Sarah J. Maas, Fourth Wing. You could probably name a dozen books that are going off at the moment. But you can see in New Zealand, there was an increase of 270% between 2017 and 2023 for romance novels. In Australia, it also more than tripled, an increase of 230%. So this is just a booming genre, and the data is showing that the readerships are getting younger. So when I started as an academic 20-something years ago, in Australia, the readership was primarily older. It was women sort of 40 to 60, with particularly the over 50s were driving the book market in Australia. That has changed now. It's getting much younger. And that kind of changes the way we speak to readers, I think, and also changes the kinds of books we stock. So young romance reading women, and they are generally women, although men do read romance, and there is a rise in LGBTQIA+ books, but it tends to be cis-het women who are driving book sales in this genre. So my research is really interested in what's going on in the genre, because it has historically been shamed, maligned, dismissed, minimised, ridiculed. The first scholarly definition of romance wasn't advanced till 2003, which seems ridiculous to me, given that the first novel published in English was a love story. She died at the end, of course, but fiction has always been focused on these kind of intimate sexual relationships, and yet the first definition was 2003. There's only been one other formal definition, which was 2016. There hasn't been that much scholarly work on romance. It's just sort of developing this century. And I think it has been maligned mostly because it's been seen as women's fiction, like silly books, and because it's focused on emotions, intimacy, and sex. I mean, literature is often focused on emotions, intimacy, and sex, but I think because it's about affect rather than intellect, it gets dismissed a lot. There's this amazing professor at New College at the University of Alabama who's a sociologist who wrote about, she kind of did an anthropological study of romance, and she says romance novels are so popular partly because they do deep and complicated work for the mostly women who read them. Romance novels help women readers, especially heterosexual women, deal with their paradoxical relationship toward men within a culture still marked by patriarchy and its component threat of violence towards women. So what we can see with the readership, and particularly the texts they're gravitating towards, is a very messy cultural conversation unfolding. So with Gen Z millennial readers, we're seeing sex positivity, but it's not simple. It's not just a simple, straightforward, joyful sex positivity. Not that I think that ever existed. But we're seeing some kind of traumas around sex play out in these books. And if you want to have a conversation later about dark romance, I think that's a really interesting thing that's happening right now. What we're seeing is readers exploring the impacts of pornification, of mainstreaming of pornography, and kind of sex acts that might once have been seen as fairly extreme being mainstreamed. We're seeing the rise in kind of engagement with coercive control and intimate partner violence. And the readership are kind of consuming texts that are both trauma porn, so kind of fetishizing those relationships, which is kind of what Colleen Hoover does, and also consuming books that are comforting, idealized, and aspirational, like Emily Henry's books. And it's not an either or, it's kind of all of it. A lot of these readers are reading all of it, or they're at least reading across the boundaries of the subgenres. And they know what they're doing. I think there's a tendency to assume kind of a passivity in this kind of readers that is rooted in sexism. This idea that they're just unthinkingly taking on board silly texts, but actually what's going on is really complicated, and the demographics mostly show a tertiary educated readership who know exactly what they're consuming, and they engage with it in really robust ways often. So if you go on BookTok or Bookstagram, you can see engagement with content at various levels. Like some people just celebrate it, some people argue with it. There are kind of conversations going on there that are quite interesting, I think. If you haven't yet looked at TikTok with the hashtag BookTok or Instagram with the hashtag Bookstagram, it's worth doing just to have a look at what's out there. If you look up Bookstagram and romance, for example, romance books or romance reads, you will see a lot of things going on that are quite surprising. So people like Colleen Hoover are actually they're touchstones for conversations that get quite vigorous. So this readership, they're really digitally literate, they're very playful, and they're exercising quite advanced literary skills in a global book community. So they could be sitting here in Adelaide or in Wellington or wherever in the world and actually putting out book criticism and connecting with other readers all the way around the world. I have a PhD student here who does reels, and she has 43,000 regular followers. So, book criticism has changed enormously, and these women have kind of been at the forefront of that. So I think as academics and as booksellers and as authors, it's a really interesting thing to go and look at what readers are engaging with. And it certainly shoots down any idea that the engagement is simple. There is you may have all noticed this total obsession with tropes. There's also a fetishization of the book. They like book things. So whether it's, I don't know, bookends or bookmarks or T-shirts or tote bags or anything bookish, partly because it's a very visual culture, is sort of celebrated as well. And the tropes rarely exist in isolation. It's almost like a playful bingo of tropes. So you might have an enemies to lovers book that's also a shared bed, is also forced proximity, is also marriage of convenience. You might have a friends to lovers book that's also grumpy sunshine, also second chance, also slow burn. And there's a kind of joyful playfulness in it. So I think, that's worth thinking about. And then the other thing about genre fiction, I think, is the identification, is that it works through identification. So Kowalty, who wrote one of the first books on genre fiction, it's very old now, but I think it's called Adventure, Mystery and Romance. He said one of the most important characteristics of these kinds of texts is the identification we're encouraged to have with the protagonists. All stories involve some kind of identification, for unless we're able to relate our feelings and experiences to those of the characters in fiction, the emotional affect will be lost. So these are books that are really about emotional affect and emotion, and trying to get the reader to feel. And romance readers particularly, like, the book only works if they feel. they want to identify and self-insert. And I think the rise of fan fiction for particularly Gen Z means that self-insertion is a really, really kind of important characteristic of these texts. I can probably skip past this because I'm going to run out of time, but it's this idea that they're trying to project or insert onto a character who's more powerful than they are, who through their journey will gather some kind of power. And I think linking back to this idea of these women existing in a culture where they're wrestling with patriarchy and wrestling with partner violence, wrestling with pornification, this idea of power is really interesting. I think if you have a look at romantasy, you often see the heroine becoming incredibly powerful over the course of those romantasy book series. And the other thing I would just point out is that they're incredibly sensitive about being patronised. And that would be, I mean, Renee mentioned the newspaper article on the weekend. It's because it happens all the time. Like you can't, you find your group of people who love romance and you can talk about it with them. But I think readers get ridiculed a lot for this genre, for loving this genre. And they're not, I mean, the younger millennial Zs have kicked back hard against that, whereas I think I'm Generation X, and it was something you hid. If you had the books, you had them in your bedroom or on your Kindle, or it wasn't something you publicly acknowledged to people that you were reading all these romances, where I think it's an identity issue for younger readers. They're absolutely claiming it and standing proud by it. The other thing they're really embracing is the idea of blurring genre lines. And so I mentioned at the beginning that the definitions don't quite hold true anymore. They're very comfortable with a romance that doesn't necessarily have a closed, happy ending. And they're very comfortable with texts that blur the line between genres, which is why we're seeing the rise of these kinds of book club women's fiction books that are also pretty heavy romances. So Tia Williams, I've got 7 Days in June up there. I don't know if anyone's read that. I think it's a brilliant book. That was a Reese Witherspoon pick, but that's kind of blurring that line between book club romance book. And then we see romantasy, obviously. We're seeing YA, the rise of YA, romance and dark romance, which I'm fascinated by at the moment. And I think the fact that romance is now making it into celebrity book clubs shows that it's uncloseted, that it's a kind of respected genre, because I don't think you ever would have seen Oprah put a romance book in her book club back in the 90s and early 2000s. So romance has kind of become a feminist badge of honor these days. I'm sure you know a lot about romantasy. It is still very dominant. I expect it will probably start to peak in the next couple of years, but I don't think it will ever disappear again. I think it's very beloved. I think these are generations who grew up with Game of Thrones, and so these are kind of very beloved fantasy worlds for them. These are the kinds of women fiction book club romance we see. So they're often tackling quite big issues, or they've got a kind of plot line that's not just purely romance. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And then around sex, you may have all noticed the heat content is quite intense, that there are some books that are incredibly sexual and incredibly sexually explicit. There are a whole lot that aren't, that close the door on sex, but the ones that go there really go there in ways that I at first found quite surprising. But then if you think about generations growing up with pornification, it's not so surprising. But the thing I would point out is that it's porn avoidant. So although they're really sexually explicit, you can see by the covers, this is not pornography. This is actually tapping into a kind of, I mean, I think if you look at Icebreaker and Wildfire, or Talia Hibbert's books like Get a Life, Chloe Brown, there's I don't want to say childishness, but there's a kind of, you know, that lovely feeling of being into YA romance. There's a innocence to them, that cartoony kind of brightly coloured innocence that maybe you're not expecting the heat content. And I think this has got, has led to some problems with book banning, where some of these books end up in high school libraries where maybe they shouldn't because they're quite explicit. But I think that's really interesting, the porn avoidant coding, that it's spicy, but we're not going to say it's that spicy. So it's sex on women's terms, and it's an acting out of really complicated ideas about sex. I personally think one of the things we're seeing is romance as a space of conflicted attitudes to sex. So it's where a kind of Disney-fied childhood is meeting pornified adult content. So how do you reconcile the fairy tale romance you grew up with in Disney with kind of hypersexuality? And I think you see that playing out in things like A Court of Thorns and Roses, and other texts. The other thing about sex sex in romance novels as opposed to sex in other cultural texts is that in romance sex, we're put in the subject position of the woman during sex. So as a reader, you're inhabiting her body during the sex act, which is very different from pornography, where we're watching a sex act being done to a body. So we're subjectified rather than objectified. And I think that is a really interesting thing about what's going on in these books. So although people like to dismiss it as kind of smart or porn, it's not quite that. It's doing something else. So part of adopting the subject position means that it's quite tangled up with the cultural tensions of being the subjectified object, of being put into the woman's body in these moments. So there's often a threat of violence, or actual violence. I don't know if everyone saw, but there's been quite a lot of media recently about studies released around choking, that a lot of young women experience choking in sex from their sexual partners. So this idea that violence is kind of an experience women are having with sex is kind of played out in a lot of the sex scenes in these books. So if we think of romance novels as a really safe fantasy space where people can go to work through some social tensions, and one of the social tensions that's really big in romance novels right now is the mess of loving in a patriarchy. What does it mean to love, if you're a heterosexual woman, what does it mean to love a man who is a potential perpetrator of violence against you? So Catherine Angel talks about this in her book, Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. She's a Cambridge scholar. She's a feminist scholar. It's a very small book, but like Bell Hooks, it's been very popular with Gen Z readers. And Angel says, bad sex emerges from gender norms in which women cannot be equal agents of sexual pursuit and in which men are entitled to gratification at all costs. It occurs because of inadequacies and inequalities in access to sexual literacy, sex education, and sexual health services. It trades on unequal power and dynamics between parties and on racialized notions of innocence and guilt. Bad sex is a political issue. She also says violence, misogyny, and shame make desire's discovery difficult and its expression fraught. So I think the dominance of romance is also speaking to a desire in female readers to explore, what does sex mean for me? So although romance often gets dismissed, the spicy romance is smart, there's a lot more happening. So Angel also says many women desperately need to hear that they deserve to explore their own sexuality free of pressure, that there may be things they want and like that are not given to them by their partners or by the images they routinely encounter in their culture, that they can say no and that they could also say what they would like. Angel says it's crucial that we create a world in which none of us is shocked by a woman's desire or its assertion. So these texts are quite feminist in that they're giving women a space to work through a lot of things. And I think that is one reason they have such a passionate following and why they become so important to the readership. Like, it's such a deeply loyal readership. So it's an active side of cultural conversation. So if you take Colleen Hoover or if you take ACOTAR, like The Court of Thorns and Roses and all of Sarah J. Maas's works, you often see really abusive relationships, but it's not that they're necessarily presented as aspirational. It's just that they're being worked through in a genre that's often been thought of as aspirational, but I think we can toss that one out. Like perhaps our grandmother's Mills and Boon books were about some kind of aspiration, but a lot of these books aren't. They're just the kind of working through. And you can see that with dark romance. I don't know how much you stock these. A lot of the big dark romance sort of started off in indie publishing, so it didn't necessarily have the gatekeeping that traditional publishing has, so anything goes. So there's bully romance, mafia romance, dark academia, the rise lately of monster romance. I don't know if anyone's seen that, with minotaurs and the dragons, and where he doesn't necessarily turn into the prince at the end, he stays the beast. I think there's a lot going on there, but the sex in these books is really extreme. So Haunting Adeline, I'm not sure if anyone's read it or heard of it, actually has cannibalism in it. It's really extreme. And often the covers do gesture at YA still. There's a book called Gild, Gild, by, is it Kennedy? I've forgotten her name, sorry. You may have seen it in your bookstores. It's about King Midas, but it starts with an orgy scene, and there is rape, and it's really quite extreme. But you would think from the cover that it was, a YA romantasy kind of series. So I think as booksellers, that's something to think about. The candy-coloured rom-coms are still really big at the moment. Again, I think the readers are often reading both, and these might be just a nice salve, a consolation, but also something a bit more aspirational. We're also seeing some of the big names in those rom-coms like Talia Hibbert and Ali Hazelwood turning to YA. Christina Lauren has also written YA. Hers are a little bit spicier, but the rise of YA, and it's not just teens and new adults who are reading these books. Often they're adults who are reading them, a bit like the way adults read Harry Potter or, I don't know, other YA books as a kind of escape. And I think also if you're not into spicy sex, you're kind of guaranteed a YA book by some of the authors that you love that's going to be closed door and not have sex in it. And then we're also seeing the rise in YA specific romantasy. LGBTQIA plus romance is booming. I think we can see representation and inclusivity as being an important value for millennial and Gen Z readers. It really matters to them, and they read outside of their own subject position, which previous generations didn't always do. And they kind of, I'll just skip ahead so we can actually talk, but basically readers drive change in this genre. And with the rise of independent publishing, BookTok, Bookstagram, you can have immediate conversations and see immediate trends, and it's really driving an industry very quickly in new directions, not always thought through either. So yeah, the take home is it's a really complex dynamic ecosystem. There are so many subgenres, so you can't really talk over an overarching way about romance, because if you're reading like a dark monster romance, is very different from reading an Emily Henry, is very different from reading, I don't know, a Colleen Hoover. They're all very different from one another. So final thoughts are the romance market is really smart, very engaged, very vocal. They're very well read. They're often also the readers who are going to buy the beautiful editions because they've got book fetishes. If you put out, those gorgeous editions of classics, the lovely hardbacks and gold leaves and special editions of things, these are the readers buying all of those as well. They're very knowledgeable about genres, about tropes, about tools and techniques. They talk about point of view. They talk about characterization. They tend to be feminist and sex positive, but I don't think like I said, the sex positivity can be really complex and messy and not always self-aware. I think a lot of the texts and what people are gravitating towards are reflecting trauma around porn and sexual violence. And a lot of these texts are showing a really complex blend of naive, youthful longing and a very early exposure to a hypersexual culture that's not necessarily thought through. So anyway, that was a big information dump, and now I'd be very happy to answer any questions or have a chat. I'm really curious about what your experiences are selling books too.
Thank you so much, Amy. I have just tried to unmute everyone, but it's not worked, so bear with me. But while I figure that out, I think you can individually come off mute. I don't know what I'm doing. I have some Teams learning. Yeah. So it sounds to me like, just tying in from what you said at the very beginning, like the increase in sales is also like it's a cultural movement. It's reflecting a cultural movement. It's reflecting that the increased porn, the feminists, like there's so much going on, and it's being reflected in, like, this is how readers are responding through books and how they choose to spend their money and what to read. So that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think we've always had a very simple, as a culture, quite a simple approach to romance.
Yeah.
And I think actually, even, I don't know if anyone ever read the old school kind of bodice ripper romances, they were also really complicated. So you can track the rise of like those 1970s Kathleen Woodiwiss kind of books alongside second wave feminism. And often you'll see a spike in romance sales alongside a feminist. Wave's a complicated way of talking about it now, but you can often see the two going hand in hand. And I think there's a kind of cultural working through that happens. Like, as we question, what does it mean to love men in this situation?
Yeah. And sorry, everyone, I'm not sure how to unmute everyone as a bulk action, but you can do it individually. So just when you do want to, just unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can raise your hand. I do have a question because with my bookseller hat on, obviously there's a lot more romance novels out there and the demand is peaking. And as booksellers, we can't read them all and we can't be across them all. And like, especially things with cannibalism in them and rape in them. And like you said about guild, like I was putting that in YA. Where
yeah, I know. I was shocked when I picked it up. Yeah, I read it for reading group and I was like, whoa.
Yeah. So I guess my question is to everyone as booksellers, like, how do you manage the huge amounts of information that you need to understand the stock that you have and understand your customers and what they want and the tropes that they want, the triggers that they don't want? There's just so much information. And building on that, do people have dedicated romance sections in their bookshops? Are they thinking about making dedicated romance sections, or what does that look like? Yeah, interested to hear what other people's experiences are. And hopefully, Rochelle, you can talk.
I'll speak. Hi, Amy. Thanks for this. It's a genre in our bookshop that I must admit I shy away from because I don't get a big demand for it in the sense of romance. When I look at what I order and what I read, there's a little section that I could pull out on my bookshelf recommendation that have romantic inclinations in there. But I really struggle, like, it's a whole new field. And because nobody comes in and asks for it, then I don't stock it. Same with fantasy. I mean, Sarah J. Maas, her earlier ones, I sold little bits and bobs. Her latest one, I thought, right, loads of people bought those earlier ones. I'm going to get a big stack. I sold one of her last one. So I kind of, if people come in and they want, I often find if people want that romance and they've got something specific in mind, they'll ask for it and they'll order it, happy to. But apart from off my recommendation shelf, which won't be labelled romance, but there might be a little romance in there, like Crawdads, where the Crawdads or Jojo Moyes or something like that. I don't get that demand for it. So it is actually quite it's a minefield. I really don't. But with your, like, looking at what were your stats, romance up 1.4 billion.
Yeah, they're huge.
Massive for me. So I'm thinking maybe if I made a little section of romance, then it would be, people will actually hear that we've got it and they'll come in and start ordering from it. So, but what am I going to order? Because when I look at, because I don't read a lot of it myself, and I must admit, my bag, I kind of sometimes, I'm of old school, We and I find knitting, it's really interesting. I'm in a knitting group, and every now and then we might, like, we meet once a week, but we might go somewhere public to a bar and have a drink, and we knit. And I know some people, old school, especially guys, they'll go, I can't believe you're sitting there knitting in public. But I realise that that's just that old hang up, right? And that's
yeah.
I love what you're talking about, because it's so not that, and it's introduced to us in a whole new field. So
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about that, because there's a kind of chicken and egg thing, right? Like, if you don't introduce people to it, they're never going to read it. And then I was talking to a bookseller in Sydney who just said, "Oh, my customers don't buy it." And I was thinking, but maybe they do. Maybe that's what they're buying on Amazon.
Yeah,
but they're just like, "Oh, well, you don't stock it, so I'll get that on my Kindle, or I'll order that."
exactly.
Yeah.
So if you had, sorry, just quickly, because I know I've taken up too much time. If you just had, and I know Renee's going to take some notes, a little recommendation, if I just want to get like 10 books, and it doesn't matter age group, but just across that could entice people, or that I'm going to ask the publisher for some reading copies, I'd love that, just so I can start a small section. That would be great.
Yeah, and Rochelle, just on there, I think maybe, I mean, I don't know about everyone's the romance behavior, but maybe because they're not seeing them on the shelves, they're not asking, because they're just thinking they're not on the shelves, but I know where I can get them. So they want to they want to see representation on the shelves, but they don't want to ask for it. Maybe, I don't know.
It can be embarrassing. I remember going to my first romance writers conference and just being like, "Oh my goodness, look, there's hundreds of women here who read romance just like me," and I would have no idea they were also. And it's like this really freeing thing to go, "Oh, you do it too. Like, this is amazing."
Yeah, and I must admit, I learned that with Colleen Hoover, because I kept getting asked for her. So that's the only reason I got her in. And for ages, especially with her first couple of books, I was selling lots, and I actually asked for a reading copy, and I read it. I won't even go there. But it did. I learned from that, and so I'm open, and I always, I mean, as all your independents know, you korero, and you have that really one-on-one, so you get to know what people like, and everybody knows that we'll order anything. But I'd love to be able to allow, people to come in and they just see, oh, that's new, oh, I like that. But because it's not my strength, and because we're inundated, I just don't even know where to start, to be honest. So that's why I'm really rapt that Renee's running this, because I've got lots of learning to do. Yeah.
And I think we've got a question from Tony, but just before we go to you, Tony, last year in New Zealand, we've got like a WhatsApp group for the booksellers, and I asked, and it wasn't a joke, I asked, is there a website where I can go to find out like what kind of sex is in what book? And asking for a friend, but it was for a customer. But like, does anyone know of any resources where you can go and see like the chili rating, or warning, this has cannibalism, or this is not okay for 16-year-olds? Does anyone know of a website? Or like, maybe that's
Renee,
a great
employ a 20-year-old, they'll tell you.
Yeah.
employ a romance reader.
I would say on that, there are romance scholars all around the world. I would be very surprised if in your universities, the ones closest to you, there wasn't a PhD student working on romance. So it might even be worth making a local connection.
Yeah, thank you. Tony, you've got your hand up.
Hi, Amy. Thanks very much. I just wanted to go back to the statistics that you were quoting at the beginning in terms of the huge growth and the volume of sales. Can you dig down into that and find out where these people are buying the books?
No, I mean, it's pretty messy. Like, there's not enough work being done in this space yet. There's not enough scholarship. There are a couple of scholars who are trying to do the metadata right now. So I'm really keen to see how that shakes out, because I think the numbers are a little bit like, I don't know how much we rely on them because it is impossible to get figures out of, some of the major corporations.
I guess that leads me to ask, are they buying books from regular bookshops, or are they buying them from online?
I think it's everything. I actually think they're listening to audiobooks, they're buying hard copy books, they've got Kindles or Nooks or whatever, they're reading on their phone. A lot of romance readers are also reading Wattpad or the fan fiction sites. They're just massive readers, like huge readers. They read constantly. But I think also, I think there's a sense of not always feeling welcome in bookshops. Like I know my local bookshop in Rundle Mall now has a giant romance section, and it is amazing how that grew slowly. But I think they found, once they developed a name for people feeling comfortable to go in there, like they got more younger readers going in because they felt like, oh, they're going to have things I like.
So it's again that chicken egg thing, like they want to maybe see it on the shelves before they ask for it.
And they are quite political, I think. Gen Z millennials are quite political and would like to support local if they can. Like I think if you can lean into the supporting local messaging, I think that can be an angle, because I think a lot of people really want to support their local booksellers.
Can I pop in on that and say I think that's really true? So with our store, we have so many young people coming, and at the start they weren't mentioning what they liked or what they wanted at all, and just quietly shopping around. And then I'm someone that reads a lot of fantasy, sci-fi and romance, and that wasn't big in our store. And I brought the conversation up just casually, like, what do you guys like? This is what I like. And everyone opened up, and so many of them were looking for romance and romantasy and all those things, but there is still that stigma, and they were quite unsure about asking. So everything you said I agree with, because now we have regulars that come in and they feel safe and want to ask, and they're like, oh, I really want this one from Colleen Hoover or whoever, and there's not that sense of shame that they're still sort of can be implied a little bit sometimes, I think. So I think it's just opening up the conversation with people as well, and just being like, everything's welcome here.
Yeah,
we all love books.
Yeah, I had a similar experience last year when I was in the bookshop, and I had someone come in who was just passing through the town, and they said, oh, look, I only read forced proximity lesbian stories. And I was like, wow, that's really specific. And I don't know any books but like with that exact trope or plot, but I'm going to Google it and see if I've got any on the shelf. And I didn't. But, you know, to your point, and Amy, like they know what they want, and some of them want to see it on the shelves before they ask for it, maybe, but then some of them only want that. So yeah, it's interesting.
So can I just ask, do you guys all have sections that would have romance? Would that be in your stores, like Bronte, because that's one of your reads, and I can hear that's a favourite. In your store, do you have it? Do you have a section that says that, or do you?
So we don't currently, but we're creating one. Okay. So it's currently mostly under the umbrella of fiction, obviously in fantasy and stuff as well, but we're really working to create like subcategories and stuff as well. So there will be like a romantasy section, and really highlighting all the different things, because I think in our store I'm the youngest one there, and I'm the only one that reads all those genres. So it actually helps the other people that work in the store as well. If I'm not there and someone comes in and asks the question, it's already set out for them. So it makes it easier for everyone, and the interaction of maybe I don't know too much, but this section. So yeah, we've got it all being set out. Yeah.
Because I guess.
Oh, sorry. If you want to share any titles, I'd be really, that'd be great. Like just some faves. So then I've got some that I can recommend with like knowing another bookseller loves them, or yeah, that would be great.
Also, like everyone's overworked, right, and under-resourced.
Yeah.
So thinking about ways you can maybe tap into local knowledge. Like I have not been lucky enough yet to go to Romance Writers of New Zealand, but if they're a vigorous group, you know, I know that my local chapter, South Australian Romance Authors, we meet at a local bookstore. They opened it up and said, if you'd like to have your meetings in our bookstore, and then we chat with them every month. And, you know, then you've got like 20 people you can say, hey, so what's going on in the romance community right now? And we all buy heaps of books as well.
Yeah.
Go home with lots of books.
The perfect customer, Amy.
Yeah. And that's so helpful, right? And we're in the provinces, and you know, you don't get that. So so that's why I'm always, and anybody that comes in, as we all are, you talk books, because you do want, if somebody, oh, I loved this and I don't know anything about sci-fi, I love a good recommendation, because you know you can pass it on with confidence if somebody loved it. Yeah.
And I think a lot of us have crime and thriller genre sections in bookshops. So, you know, why not give romance a go? Or romantasy a go? And as I think Bronte was saying, it makes it easier for our team, like everyone in your team on the bookshop floor. You're sharing that knowledge automatically. I did have a question from Lou and Wardini's. How do booksellers cope with younger readers or kids trying to buy adult books like Guild or Colleen Hoover? And because some Colleen Hoover are written for YA, but it's like hard to keep all that knowledge in your head. Does anyone have any anecdotes or experiences that they want to share?
I feel like I'm talking too much. I just have really open, honest conversations with them, because I think sometimes we forget that even if it's like a 14 or 15-year-old, when we were that age, you're really into that stuff. You want to read about it. You want to know. It's all really exciting. So maybe if there's content that you don't think is appropriate or a bit too dark or whatever. So I had a girl come in and order a book, and it was called Credence, I think. And specifically on 18, it's got like a minor in it and an older man, and it's very dark. And so I just had a really honest conversation with her, and I was like, I need you to read all of these trigger warnings first. It's your choice. I'm not, like, you don't have to ask my permission, but I just want to make sure that you're aware of some of the material might be a bit
Tony, you had your hand up again. Did you have a question?
I'm just going to make a comment that obviously these readers are not going to come into my shop and have this conversation with me. It's just not going to happen. And so I'm fortunate that my assistant buyer is 23, and she reads a lot of fantasy. And I simply use her guidance. I say, you choose. She quite often looks at books, and I say, well, what about this one? And she said, that's too spicy for you. I'm not going to read it. Is it too spicy for the people who want to read it? And so we're working through that. We've created a fantasy, a romantasy section, I guess, which is just 5 shelves, and we're just experimenting with trying different authors who appear to be in vogue, and we're just watching what people are buying, and who's buying it, without obviously making them self-conscious about buying it. But and we've certainly noticed, I mean, it would be a very, very small genre for us, but it's growing, and we are getting more young girls and young women sort of in their late teens, early 20s, who are coming into the shop and they go straight to that section.
So they've heard about it, you think, Tony?
Sorry?
Do you think they've heard, do you think it's word of mouth, or do you think they just happen to come in and they're looking for that section?
I think they're looking. I can't imagine it's word of mouth, but maybe it is. But we've made the section look different. It's not just another section of the fiction section. It's actually got its own shape, and we display the books a little bit differently, and they all look similar. I mean, we've had no success at all with Colleen Hoover, but we have had success with Rebecca Yarros and that sort of darker romance. And my assistant convinced me to read Rebecca Yarros, which I did, And I mean, I'm reasonably experienced in the world, but I was shocked by the mindless violence. It seemed to be completely anarchic and strange. I couldn't quite get my head around it, but I'm not the target market.
Mm.
Thank you, Tony. Bailey, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to go back to the question of what do you say when a young person brings these books up? And I think it's important to note that a lot of young people are looking at reviews and videos about these books on TikTok and on Instagram.
Mm.
So it's very likely that they but yeah, important to think about, I guess. And I did have a question. Some people don't really feel that the cartoon covers on romance books are appropriate for the content. And we've talked a little bit about this with books being incorrectly shelved, but do you think romance books need to be packaged better, and should we bring back the bodice ripper covers?
I saw they're having a moment. There's a new book out, and I can't remember the author, where they've actually replicated an old bodice ripper cover. So I feel like they're going to have a kitschy moment. I don't know, because I think what happened, because the first one I kind of remember was the Kiss Quotient, that Helen Huang book a few years ago, where it kind of peaked around that era. And I think it was a generational shift. I think the cartoon cover initially just said, "This is not your mother's romance novel." But I don't know, because it's so coded now. I'm not sure like how you'd get rid of it anymore. But there's different, because the Emily Henrys are more adult. Christina Lauren, Emily Henry kind of graphic covers don't look as childish.
One thing that is huge is sport romance. Sport rom. I don't know if it's got a shortened name, but just I read an article. It's not just hockey; it's like every single sport there is romance in there. So again, speaking to that representation kind of point. But has anyone else noticed, aside from Icebreaker, we don't have many sport books, not for young adults, not for middle grade readers. But now we've got lots in the romance genre. But are people finding that in their bookshops? Or are we just reading about it and we'll see it reflected on our shelves in a couple of months?
I didn't include that as a slide, but that is one of the new trends. Yeah, even golf, tennis, like Tessa Bailey's got the new golf book out that's been going off.
Yeah. Again, but because I didn't realize Icebreaker was so sexually explicit, because I just saw the cover and thought.
Yeah, and that one particularly, the colors make it look quite young, like it's going to be quite sweet.
And to Bailey's point, like the readers are seeing it on BookTok, they know what's in it, and that's why they want it. So they're not just picking it up because they see it as popular in BookTok. They actually know about the contents, and they know about the tropes and they've
also been exposed to far more sexual content than I think older generations were. So I think things that I might think of as incredibly spicy, my 23-year-old PhD students do not think of that as very extreme. So there's a generational shift around sex there as well, I think.
And Karen Ferns from HarperCollins has just said Formula One romance.
Oh, so, yeah, that I'm obsessed with Formula. I just watched it, the race on the weekend. So yes, I think that's on the rise.
Yeah, amazing. Any other little Louise from Wardini's, what if you have a 10-year-old asking for these kind of books?
I think that's a great question. I would say no to some of them. I would. And we remember when American Psycho used to be plastic wrapped. I think some of these books are probably too extreme. For that age group.
I guess, Lou, maybe ask if you can talk to their parents before they buy it. I don't know. Is that something that we could do?
Is there an equivalent, like horror?
I do. Sorry. If kids come in and they want to buy something and I know that it's definitely not age appropriate, I'll say to them, oh, do you want to bring, your grandma or your mum or dad and whoever you're hanging out with, and we'll have a chat around it. And I just say, like, if the parents come in, I do say, like, I'm just letting you know it's quite advanced, and I recommend, the reading age recommendation is 15 plus or whatever it is. And then it's up to them, right? So it takes it off us, and especially with grandparents, because grandparents often don't know, and that's fine. And so I don't want them coming back on the bookstore, and also some of the kids don't even realise, they've just heard about it, and they want to read it. So
would you have an equivalent with horror or something where you wouldn't sell a book? Like if you had a 10-year-old wanting to take a Stephen King book home, or
yes, yeah, I'd do the same. It's not sex, it's just whether it's appropriate, or at least letting people know that it's not aimed at this age group.
See, I think you could just make it. If it's not genre specific, it's just a policy.
True.
Adult content.
Yeah.
Yep.
Everyone, it's 8:00 New Zealand time, so I'm just going to ask for last questions, because we have a guru amongst us. So this is your last chance to really ask anything. That's a safe space, and this is your time, and I want it to be valuable and have an impact on your businesses. So last questions for Amy or the group, or any comments.
I'm beginning to realise that you could develop a consultancy work, Renee, like just handing out reading lists. If you want to see everyone needs a curator.
Yeah. Look, it was amazing in Australia, and it's so informative again now. I just think there's some real practical implications for our bookshops, and it really reflects a big movement in our cultures that we should be mindful of. I also think it's really like it's changing. It's a really dynamic movement, and the romance that we're looking at now will be different to the romance we're looking in at Christmas time and next year. And so we really need to keep, the booksellers, and we need to keep this conversation going and keep on sharing knowledge amongst ourselves and reflecting on what's happening in our shops, and because it's not going to go away. I don't want it to go away. I think it's great, and I just encourage us all to keep on talking. So just very quickly, thank you so much, Amy. This has been.
Thanks for having me. This
has been.
I would love to hear from all of you one day. I'd love to hear what's going on in the bookstores.
Yeah,
Can I just say something?
We'll go for it, Ron.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that I've noticed there's definitely been it's been an increase in people buying romance novels in the bookstore, and these really well put together young 20-year-old young women are coming in and buying the books. And I really had no romance in the bookstore for many years, and I just started adding a few at a time, and people buy them online like this. I get some really odd ones from Ingram Spark, and they always sell via our website through the romance section or the fantasy section. So I'm just finding that and people in their 50s are coming in and buying those books as well. They weren't previously. And I just want to say that this is a great opportunity for all of us, because I know it's really sad what's happened with Booktopia, but we need to kind of like seize the day and try and there's going to be a bit of a vacuum for a little while, so we really need to work hard to kind of encourage people to buy from local independent bookstores and not go to the big online shop that shouldn't be mentioned.
Yeah, well said, Bron, and I agree with you. It's just this is your chance to showcase your amazing inventories and your curation online and get those new customers. But yeah, I just thank you everyone for your time and sharing your experiences and your knowledge and asking questions. I'm really grateful, and I want to do this again. So we will keep up this conversation. I am going to be sending a feedback survey, just because I want to do more of these, but I want to do them the best way possible. So your feedback on today's event would be great. Just I know you're all on mute. A round of applause for Amy. You're amazing.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you so much. And I hope you all have a lovely evening.